Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 9, a special encore episode. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
For this week, we're reprising a popular episode from the fall of 2022 that we think deserves a second or perhaps your first listen. With the original title of The World's First Omni-channel Executive, we're updating and having a little bit of fun with a twist to the title, The World's First Omni-channel or Unified Commerce Executive. Steve, we went back and forth on which should be our first encore episode of the season. Why did you land on this one as the encore episode? And what's up with this new title that we've come up with?
Well, I feel like it's, and I think we touched on this a bit in a few prior episodes, but all of a sudden it seems unified commerce is getting a lot of attention as a concept and term. There was a whole track at the recently completed Shop Talk Fall conference on this. And I'm just kind of curious, on the one hand, why unified commerce is suddenly getting all this attention, because for me, it's actually kind of an old term, but it also seems really similar to omni-channel. So because we talked through what we mean by omni-channel, what's important about it a couple years ago, I thought it might be good to revisit this and before we get into the episode, just have a few comments about why we've tweaked the title.
And it really, as I re-listened to the episode, it's what was it, fall 2022, just as relevant today as it was back then, right? So talk more about your philosophy, or why what we think is so relevant or still relevant or even more relevant looking forward for this encore episode.
Well, as listeners will hear, part of the thrust for doing the world's first omni-channel executive episode in the first place was really commenting on how, whether we called it omni-channel or not, the idea of being customer-centric instead of channel-centric, recognizing that digital and physical channels were increasingly, the lines between those were increasingly being blurred, that we need to break down data silos, organizational silos, all those kinds of things, and trying to create this more seamless, or I like to call it harmonized shopping experience. Those ideas are hardly new. So as people will hear, I was working on what we called multi-channel at the time, starting in 1999. So part of what we're talking about in this episode is, why has it taken so long, regardless of what you call it, for companies to actually embrace the strategies, the technologies, the metrics, et cetera, to bring this all together? So there's also just a little bit about, I guess, the semantics that people throw around. Unified commerce is gaining all this popularity. And I guess that sort of begs the question, well, what's new and different compared to omni-channel, compared to seamless, frictionless, phygital? There's a lot of these terms. And I do think to a certain degree, there's a little bit of rebranding that maybe conference organizers want to have something new rather than just repeating. Vendors may want to have something new. But I think, the bottom line is that the underlying concepts are still incredibly important. Why, if you're behind, has that happened? What do you need to do to close the gap minimally? If you're kind of regularly falling behind on some important things, what I call kind of sleepwalking through the revolution, what's that about? But beyond, I guess, the semantics, I think it's really understanding kind of what's foundational. And I would argue, if you're going to provide, again, whatever you call it, harmonized, frictionless experience, having a unified approach is really kind of table stakes. If you don't have the data pulled together, if you don't have the organization working in a unified fashion, if your metrics aren't more unified, you're going to have a hard time doing those things that are really going to make you remarkable. So anyway, that's a little bit long-winded, but that's kind of the updated context. And then we'll get into some of the things which I think are still quite relevant.
We did want to take this opportunity to thank the folks at NRF. Some big news breaking this week. The folks at NRF and Rethink Retail for naming Steve and I two of the top retail voices by NRF for 2025. It's a great group. Yeah, it's great, right? It's a great group of colleagues, several of whom have been on the pod. And of course, we'll be in New York for the NRF Big Show. You'll be able to catch Steve at the Flo Rida concert, no doubt, on Monday night. So if you want to catch up with you'll be there, I'm sure. And we'll have lots of updates.
People are going to be like, what the hell is he talking about?
Great guests. We'll have great guests. And Steve, both of us have pretty busy agendas during the week, but I think there's still space on both our dance cards for private events, yeah?
Yeah, potentially. And if not for NRF, certainly for some other events that are happening next year. So let us know. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this NRF Retail Voice thing is a new thing. And I think there's going to be quite a bit of buzz around the show. So something's still to be announced. So I imagine that'll be coming out in the next few weeks. So folks can look for that. And I'm sure we'll engage in our usual amount of shameless self-promotion within future episodes.
Well, maybe an extra dose of shameless self-promotion just because of this and the run up to the big show. All right, so no news this week. We'll be back with an all-new episode next week with another great interview from the Bamboozer Podcast Studio at Shop Talk Fall in Chicago. Until then, everyone, stay safe and keep calm and carry on. Well, Steve, we've been at a couple of conferences together in the past month, a couple of spins in Vegas and some other places. And one of the things we both commented on or observed or kind of rolled our eyes a little bit is how many speakers and how much content and how many analysts go, wow, they're embracing Omni-channel. And this isn't just retail. We were at the convenience store conference and, people were saying Omni-channel as if it's some kind of new idea. And I love your comeback to that, which is something about a press release.
Yeah, I feel like 2010 called and wanted its press release back. It's kind of like a rant alert here because I feel like this is really going to rile me up.
Yeah.
But I feel like if you're getting on stage, and we may lose like half the listeners here, but if you're getting on stage at a conference and you feel like the big thing you have to offer to the world is that you've discovered that consumers like to shop in physical and digital channels, you may have been in a cave for like 15 years.
I think you're actually being generous when you say that 2010 called and wants its press release back. I remember writing press releases in the late 90s, early 2000s about this idea of convergence and whatever we were calling it back then, right? I mean, and this is the essence of our talk today.
One of the things I'm going to talk about, I'll do a little bit of a preview here, maybe we'll put a link in the show notes, is I'm going to preview some of the new work I'm doing for a new book at the NRF show in January. And one of the things, and you and I have talked about this a little bit offline, one of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of being able to drive innovation forward is this idea of and borrowing this from our great guest, Stephen Pressfield, of doing the work, of really being hyper aware and digging deep to understand what is going on in and around you in the industry and trying to make sense of that as early as you can and accepting what is the emerging new reality and taking action. And I think just about anybody in retail that has been doing that over the last 20 years would have been much further along in many of their innovation strategies, not just like 2 or 3 years ago, but in many cases, if you look back at what many companies were doing, to your point, 20 years ago, there's a lot of activity. You and I think, share sort of the same history. I started working back, and maybe it's a little bit of a reveal here in terms of this idea of who was the world's first omni-channel executive, because I joke around in my book, I think it might have been me. And it's not so much about my bona fides or whatever, but in 1999, and I used to actually open some of my keynotes with this, I would put a quotation up without saying who it is attributed to. And the quotation is something like, "The future of our brand will be determined by our ability to meet our customers' needs anytime, anywhere, anyway." And then I asked people...
Wait a minute. I think I heard that on the stage at the NAC show last week.
Maybe. Well, I asked people, well, who do you think said this? Or, if you don't know the person in particular, what was their job and when did they say it? Now, the most common, sometimes I get like Jeff Bezos, those sort of guesses, but I would say the most common physical or legacy retailer executive is Terry Lundgren at Macy's, because he was the guy that really started to talk about omni-channel a lot. So that's the guess. But it's wrong. It was much earlier. It was 1999, and it was Arthur Martinez, the CEO of Sears, of all places. And that was something that he said. I was working at Sears at that time. That was something he said at our annual officers meeting. And there were some people in strategy, not me, that had been looking at the potential impact of e-commerce. We had already launched Sears.com several years earlier, so e-commerce wasn't new. But this idea of the blurring of the lines, the blending of the channels, was something that people were looking at. And we came out of that meeting, among other things, deciding that we needed an enterprise-wide initiative to work on this idea of channel integration. We didn't call it omni-channel, but channel integration, and that they should name an executive to lead it. And that guy, spoiler alert, was me. So in 1999, I became, March, I think it was, of 1999, I became the vice president of multi-channel integration at Sears, and the charge.
AKA the world's first omni-channel executive.
Well, perhaps. Yeah. But the point of this story, though, is, and it's hard to say this in a nice way because Sears hasn't exactly lit up the world in the last 25 years.
Wait a minute.
Haven't noticed, they're barely in business anymore. But if Sears could be this forward thinking and started spending millions of dollars trying to understand how to be one face to the customer, to be a single brand operating in multiple channels. If that was the level of insight that we were developing more than 20 years ago, what have the rest of y'all been doing all this time? It's kind of like,
well, you make a really interesting point that Sears.com, and to be clear to the listener, we're not talking about e-commerce, because Sears.com had launched prior. I mean,
e-commerce was not new.
Right. I mean, in 1998, I was helping Levi sell the first pair of jeans online. I didn't really become it didn't have the same title, but I launched Hudson's Bay, HBC.com e-commerce in 2000. So we're in the same, as you said earlier, we're in the same kind of time zone. But this idea of the omni-channel, because when I launched Hudson's Bay, we was pick up in store, returns to store, and it was blowing everybody's minds about how the two things were coming together. But we're not talking about e-commerce here. We're talking about something more strategic than that.
Absolutely. And the other thing, and I quote this guy in my book, there's our VP of marketing at Sears at the time was a guy named Bob Thacker. And he famously, at least within the halls of Sears, very famously said that our mantra had to be silos belong on farms, which I have used ad nauseum since then.
Great. It's a great line.
But what we recognized, and this is, again, why it makes me so crazy that we're even talking about this 23 years later, is we recognized that if you were going to be in service to the customer, if you're going to be truly customer-centric, the single biggest barrier was all the silos. The data silos, the inventory silos, the metrics, this idea that e-commerce and stores were kind of in competition with each other. So that was
that's a great chestnut, right? The cannibalization chestnut, which comes up still to this day.
Well, right. And also this idea, which, I actually learned more about, flash forward about 5 years when I was at Neiman Marcus and was running strategy, but also responsible for multi-channel. We very much understood. So this is 2004. We very much understood that most of our customers were already active in multiple channels. That might be researching online to buy in the store. But it was very clear. And, there is this whole issue of, the multi-channel customer is your best customer. I think that actually maybe confuses causality. It turns out your high spending customers do more of everything with you. So I think and we did actually study that some more, and that's probably a topic for a different day. But in any event, it was very clear even back, more than 15 years ago, that there was this cross-channel behavior, that stores were advertising for online and online was advertising for stores. So again, I think this is all well known. I had meetings with Best Buy, Williams-Sonoma, JCPenney, Home Depot. All these companies were pretty aware of this more than 15 years ago. So the question is, given that this was out there in the ether, and given that there are certainly plenty of white papers and conference presentations, going back more than 10 years ago, why weren't more companies deeply aware of this, really accepting that this was the reality that they had to confront, but most importantly, taking the aggressive action. So I really think if you haven't been acting this way, for years, what is the issue there? Because that should be addressed. And frankly, I still think that why boards have tolerated this is beyond me.
Let's peel that back. So, as we often say, our podcast isn't a history lesson. It's a strategy podcast. So let's talk about a couple of elements that probably hold people back, but then let's spend most of our time thinking about going forward. So the things that hold people back, and you and I have talked about this on the podcast and off mic, is sometimes it's the nomenclature, it's semantics, it's, descriptors that don't really help the average retail think through what omni-channel and phygital and all these ridiculous things actually mean, and actually take us backwards, not forwards. Do you think that's a contributing factor?
Well, I don't love to get too caught up in the semantics, and I've been accused sometimes of making a big deal about that because I think, I hate the term phygital, and, I often said on the stage many times, I only have two complaints about omni-channel. It's the omni and it's the channel part. Right. But the substance of that is it's not about channels. This channel-centric thinking, which is so pervasive, has been the single biggest barrier to progress, I would say, in retail in at least a decade. And the omni part is also a problem because it is not about being everywhere. It is about showing up in remarkable ways in context where it matters. So I think, you could argue nobody necessarily interprets omni-channel literally, but I do think it can push us in the wrong direction. Similarly, creating a seamless experience. Customers don't, when have you ever heard a customer talk about, it's a pretty good company, but there's too many seams, Yeah. Just don't pick language that is not customer friendly or confusing. So it's not about semantics. I think, ultimately it's about where it takes us. And it's important to take friction out of the customer experience. It's important to, get rid of those seams. It's important for things to be more unified. But most of those things are table stakes. What are the things that are really going to differentiate you, and what is getting in the way of you doing that? If not, we don't have a time machine. You can't go back and do the things you should have done 10 years ago. But what do you need to do today?
And I still find that sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, asking the wrong questions, right? How's your e-commerce sales? How's your store sales? When more and more, as you've often said, it's a distinction without a difference. And that really, I know when we're talking and doing interviews with folks, that comes up often. In other words, when you talk about measurement, you're not really measuring necessarily or even asking the right questions, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's totally unimportant to pay attention to e-commerce sales. But when we know that for most companies, most web traffic actually drives behavior in a physical store channel, you can absolutely, and I can point to plenty of companies that have chased the growth of e-commerce or trying to make, quote unquote, e-commerce profitable, that have led themselves to totally the wrong place. If you're trying to make e-commerce, just think, I'll give you one example. If you're focused on improving e-commerce conversion, but it turns out your e-commerce site is incredibly good at driving people to your store, you will actively change things to improve e-commerce conversion that will cause your physical store performance to be worse. Or if you say, we've got to break even in e-commerce. Well, again, if the role of your digital assets primarily pay off in the store, you will systematically underinvest in your digital assets because it doesn't look like they're making money. But it's completely because you're not thinking about the customer and you're not measuring the right things. So this is again why this channel-centric thing is really take you to a bad place.
Well, let's talk about measurement there. I mean, retailers I talk to struggle sometimes to measure that kind of direct accountability to their e-commerce site. They know it intuitively, but there's different places that retailers are along that journey. What's your best advice for measuring that properly?
Well, first and foremost, you should have customer-centric measurements. You should have customer segmentation, and you should be paying attention to how you're doing with each of those segments in terms of acquiring customers, growing the activity with those customers, so average transaction value, frequency. You should have measures of retention, and you should have some sort of measure of remarkability or net promoter score. So first and foremost, you should have a top-down customer-centric measurement. And within that, you will see where the customers are active, and you should do this in a channel agnostic way. So you don't really care very much where they spend. So if you start from that premise top down, you'll go a long way. And there are plenty of companies that have started to do this. Mm-hmm. The second thing is to think about what's really the economic unit of value. And again, too many companies are, well, we have the website, that's our store 101 or whatever. They think about it as a thing.
Going to make it the biggest store in the chain, right? I mean, that was an objective. I remember that was an objective 10 years ago for us, is let's make the online store one of the top, 10 or top 1 or store. And that right there puts you into a framework that may or may not be useful, right?
100%. And just think how much better it would be if you took, say, the city of Toronto, where let's say you had 5 stores, and you said, our goal is to double our total growth in the store or in the city, irrespective of what channel you spend in. Mm-hmm. I have no question that if you had made that decision, that would be a far better outcome than trying to make your e-commerce site a certain size or break even.
And it addresses the cannibalization chestnut that we continue to hear, right? You're just taking sales and moving them to a different place. You're not growing the market.
Correct. But, unfortunately, the brands you're competing with that are channel agnostic, they don't really care. Now, when I say they don't really care, you should pay some attention to how you're investing your money and where you see the ROI. But the choice between physical and digital is largely a false choice. That stores drive your online business. That's another thing that's funny to me but again, it just sort of proves the lack of awareness on the part of some companies. But, some of these digitally native vertical brands that said, when we open stores, our online business goes up. And, my polite response is, no shit, Sherlock. All that shows you is you haven't been paying attention to all these other direct-to-consumer brands like Williams-Sonoma, like Sur La Table, like REI, like Land. It's a huge list that have known that, since the 80s, frankly. But certainly, that is a very known phenomenon because people understand the interaction between physical and, first it was mail order or direct mail. Now it's online. So, you got to be paying attention to what people understand and apply it in in this new context. So really, I think you've got these customer segment metrics should be one of the driving factors. Mm-hmm. Secondarily, you should be thinking about your trade area dynamics, irrespective of exactly where the sale happens to be rung up. Because that's the other thing we've talked about a bunch of times a lot of e-commerce is where it's ordered. It's not necessarily where it's fulfilled or how the demand is generated. Now, having said all that, it's still complicated, and attribution is not terrific. But I can tell you that the channel-centric metrics will take you to the wrong place. So if you can move at all to more customer segment, trade area specific measurements, you will be moving in the right direction, and you'll be making better decisions.
Now, one of the dominant narratives a couple of years ago during the COVID era was the acceleration of e-commerce. Now, we know that by and large was not the case, certainly not by any number of 10 years. It was a little bit more the case, by the way, in Canada. But still, do you have any perception that the COVID era accelerated or changed perspectives? I mean, I know when I talk to executives, they're now focused on being more agile. Was there an upside, so to speak, to perceptions or strategy out from the COVID era of retail, those couple of crazy years that we spent?
Well, I think where we've seen, you're right, there hasn't been as much acceleration as is commonly thought. I think where the acceleration has occurred, it's largely in, what we talk about as kind of the buying versus shopping, the errands versus experience. I think people got exposed to how much time they waste, running errands where they could easily get something delivered, or they just have been exposed to some other categories. So I think it's put us on a path we were kind of already on, and in some cases accelerated by 6 months, in some cases accelerated by maybe 18 months. But a lot of that e-commerce acceleration, to the point I was making earlier, actually involves stores. So, a lot more fulfilled from store, whether that's through the mail or local delivery, and a lot more customers going to pick it up themselves. And so that's another dynamic of convenience. It's just, I think, and it's again why I think thinking of e-commerce as a channel isn't that helpful, because it's a means to order, or it's a means to gather information. Mm-hmm. And, that we've been on that path for a long time as well. It just kind of accelerated a little bit. But, the question is, okay, so given that that's happened, what's the implication? Well, the implication is even more awareness around the blurring of the lines, that it isn't about two separate channels. It's about the customer being the channel, and they're going to avail themselves of many ways to learn about our product, to order the product, to go get it or have it delivered to them. So it's really stepping back and just saying, we're a brand operating in many different ways, communicating with customers in many different ways, including, TikTok or whatever. And we have to configure our business in such a way to meet those customers' needs in a remarkable way and make money. That's the other part is, you have to pay attention to the underlying costs of some of this. So that's where being sort of aware of the fulfillment mechanisms and the marketing costs, that's very important. But, again, that's pretty blurred, given that digital advertising is going to pay off sometimes for you in a store, sometimes for you in an e-commerce transaction. And the same customer may operate act one way one day and act a completely different way the next way with the same brand.
So let's bring this home. Let's tie this together, if you could, with advice to the listeners. And I'm going to ask this in a framework I find kind of fun, and hopefully the listeners will find interesting. 2 starts and 1 stop. So 2 things the listeners should do today. They may already be doing them, but generally, your advice, 2 things they should start doing right away, and 1 thing they should stop doing that maybe they've been doing, it doesn't work, or just never worked. So 2 starts, 1 stop.
Well, I'll do the stop first. This isn't the most helpful advice because many of our listeners may not be in charge of this, but the main one is to break down the silos. And unfortunately, that usually has to start at the top of the organization, just because if we work in a more junior way. I had this case at one of the places where I work, where I was very passionate about breaking down the silos, but my boss wasn't so passionate, and he got to decide how things played out there. But getting away from the channel-centric siloed thinking would be the big stop. The start, I would say, one is do customer journey mapping. The more you map out different customers' behaviors or paths to purchase, whatever you want to call it, the more you unlock opportunities to provide this more harmonized experience and to see how digital and physical interact, and how, frankly, the same customer can start in a digital channel and go to a physical channel, or start in a physical channel and go to a digital channel, and back and forth, particularly on mobile devices. And then the other start I would say is to really rethink your metrics. What does success look like at the customer level in terms of acquiring, growing, retaining, and having the word spread about your brand, as well as at the trade area level, where you're really channel agnostic in terms of your overall results.
Well, all right. Well, it's a great discussion. I mean, you and I are clearly passionate about this subject. So, and again, every time we talk this through, I get a little clearer. So hopefully that's the case with the listeners. Hopefully that they take away something from our discussion, a little bit of brief history and time, and your, maybe give you a trophy or something, the first Omni-channel executive.
I get the participation award. Yeah, I got a certificate participation award.
If you want some energy on your LinkedIn profile, you should just add that and see what happens.
I had another suggestion for changes to my LinkedIn profile, so maybe I'll just start doing some A/B testing and see what happens.
You'll hear from all kinds of folks, no doubt. And listen, thanks everybody for tuning in. and another great episode. We'll be back next week, and let's leave it there. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 9 will be available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.